should Hamas be bound by international law?
They are bound by international law. In other words, if you look at international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, they apply not just to governments, but also to rebel groups operating in their territory. So what Hamas did on October 7th was a blatant war crime. You cannot attack civilians. You cannot abduct civilians. So they are bound by international law. The International Criminal Court prosecutor was absolutely right to charge 3 leading Hamas officials for what happened on October 7th and since. So in that sense, there's no real quarrel there. Some people say, oh, because Israel commits war crimes, it's okay for Hamas to do that. That's wrong. A basic rule of international law is war crimes by one side never justify war crimes by the other. So by the same token, the fact that Hamas committed war crimes, committed atrocities on October 7th, in no sense justifies Israel's many, many war crimes since then.
Taking a broader historical view, you look at the struggle for Algerian independence that involved what we would call war crimes committed by the FLN, targeting of civilians. If you want to go back even further, the slave uprisings, the uprising of Nat Turner that involved, the slaughter of children and women. Has there been a successful anti-colonial struggle which didn't breach the Geneva Conventions in some way, or the conventions around war and the use of violence?
Well, first, just to be clear, the standards that I outline, today's international humanitarian law, really began in 1949 with the adoption of the Geneva Conventions. Yeah. They were a response to...
Yeah, they didn't exist in slave owning times, but I'm saying, imagine yourself as a time traveler or something.
No, in others. So I'm Doctor Who. So but I think, maybe the best example is Gandhi. In other words, India's anti-colonial movement was, not exclusively, but largely a pacifist movement. There was an appeal to people's, sense of morality, the sense of right and wrong. And it was just wrong for Britain to be controlling India, exploiting India. So I actually don't believe that an anti-colonial struggle has to resort to atrocities. There are other ways to do it.
The Indian example is interesting because there are those who think that the history of violence has been downplayed as part of, the making of post-colonial relations between India and the UK. The things we don't talk about is that, the UK couldn't hold on to India because it was wildly overstretched and decimated after World War II. And the other thing that we don't talk about is the importance of something like the Chittagong uprising of, 31 and the fact that there was a history of armed struggle. But going back to Algeria or even, slave uprisings, I suppose the thing I'm asking you is, is there an argument that if liberation movements were to abide by international law exclusively and all the time, that actually some, or if not the majority of them, would never have succeeded, and we would end up with a less just present because of it?
Yeah, look, this is a complex historical question. I'm not sure we can address in the few minutes left here, but let me try to answer it this way. The law has kind of 2 distinct segments to it. One looks at the justness of your cause. The other looks at the means that you use to fight. And so you can have a completely just cause, liberation, getting rid of an occupation. But that does not justify using war crimes to achieve your means. There is no defense to war crimes, regardless of the justice of your cause. And that's why, coming back to October 7th, Hamas is perfectly justified to seek an end to the occupation. It is not justified to use war crimes as a means, because if you allow war crimes by one side, you end up allowing war crimes by the other. You end up authorizing the powerful party, Israel, to starve and bomb Palestinian civilians. And the only way to ensure some respect for that law, to actually allow pressure to end these atrocities, is to insist that nobody has a right to commit war crimes, regardless of the justice of their cause, because everybody thinks their cause is just. The Israeli government says, oh, we're just fighting terrorism. So if you allow, perceived justness to justify war crimes, you then have no law against war crimes. And that's why I think it's important to maintain this distinction.
Final question. We seem to be in a time where, at least in the global north, the human rights framework seems to be weakening. There seems to be less, democratic enthusiasm for it. Is there anything that gives you hope?
Well, I am hopeful because, first of all, when it comes to kind of core human rights, everybody wants them for themselves. I've traveled the world. I've never met somebody who wants to be tortured, who wants to be politically imprisoned, who wants to face discrimination. The problem is that people sometimes want these human rights violations for their enemies. And I think that the challenge here is, at least within societies, to build a strong enough sense of national community that people recognize that, just because the autocrat pretends that, this subsegment of society, say LGBT people, that they somehow are the others and you can persecute them without risking your own rights, people recognize that that's a false claim, and that, in a sense, all of our rights do depend on recognition of everybody else's rights. So, at bottom, I think that most people do buy that. I also, take heart from what I mentioned earlier, which is that people who live in societies without rights have made clear time and time again, coming onto the streets in large numbers at risk of arrest or even being shot, that they want an accountable government. They want a rights-respecting government. And so even though in the West, yes, we're seeing people who, because they're falling for this autocratic sleight of hand, this autocratic effort to demonize some minority in lieu of offering a real program for positive treatment of the needs of working class society, I think people see through that. I think that, as autocrats take power, they fail, they don't deliver. So I do, over the long term, have confidence. But, I open my book with Martin Luther King's quote about how the arc of justice is long, but it bends toward the arc of
the moral arc of the universe is long,
yeah,
but it bends towards justice.
And I point out that, that's not true. And even Dr. King admitted it's not true later in the speech. It only bends toward justice if there's a struggle. And what I describe in the book is that the importance of it being a persistent struggle. You can't go home and say, oh, we won today, we're not going to keep fighting tomorrow. But also, regardless of the target, regardless of the despot or dictator you're facing, there is always an angle where people who promote human rights can find to put pressure on the target and to force an abusive government to behave better. And the book is filled with examples of that. And I am confident that the same methodology that I described kind of over a period of time in the book works today and will work tomorrow to force governments to respect human rights, even when their natural inclination is not to want to do that.